3 years ago, every American who owned a bump stock, a rifle accessory that facilitates rapid firing, was guilty of a federal felony punishable of up to 10 years in prison. This happened because federal regulators began to reinterpret an existing law called the Interpretive Rule, which bans machine gun conversion devices.
On Wednesday of this week, the United States Supreme Court considered the question of whether that was allowed. The case in question, Garland versus Cargill, asks whether bump stocks are prohibited under the, quote, best reading of the federal statute covering machine guns. Joining us now to break down the case is Senior Litigation Counsel at the New Civil Liberties Alliance, Richard Samp. Thanks for joining us, Richard.
My pleasure. Good morning.
So it's my understanding that Mr. Cargill purchased these bump stocks in April of 2018 when they were still legal. So can you help us, break down for our viewers what the main contention of Garland is with Mr. Cargill?
On the one hand, it's merely a dispute as to the meaning of the definition of a machine gun. But what it really comes down to is that for many, many years, the federal government interpreted machine guns as not including semi-automatic weapons or devices that could make semi-automatic weapons shoot more rapidly. The ATF, however, following a mass shooting in Las Vegas in 2017, decided to reinterpret that rule, and it claimed that the law had always prohibited bump stocks. That's really not a plausible interpretation of the statute. And so the lower court in our case, by a vote of 13-3, agreed with our interpretation of the law and said that it was not proper for ATF to retroactively turn 500,000 Americans into felons.
Yeah, so I mean, your point about the machine gun statute is well taken, Richard, because bump stocks don't change the mechanics of the gun. They don't turn a semi-automatic weapon into an automatic weapon. They simply allow someone to fire a semi-automatic weapon more rapidly. It's still one trigger pull for one bullet that's fired from that gun. So it also seems like your contention in this case is that Congress should be making these changes to gun policy as opposed to retroactive rulemaking from the ATF. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, in general, one of the important aspects of the separation of powers is you can't have the same government official both writing the criminal laws and enforcing it. And of course, the Justice Department and one of its divisions, ATF, are in charge of enforcing the laws. So if you allow the prosecutor to also write the law, you are putting an extraordinary amount of power into one branch of government. That's why we say criminal laws ought to be written by Congress, not by the executive branch.
So there are no bump stocks, just to be super clear, that can allow a rifle to be converted into a weapon that automatically fires more than one shot with the single action on the trigger. Is that right?
That is our interpretation of the statute. And basically, at the Supreme Court on Wednesday, some of the justices, particularly Justice Jackson, said, well, we think that the real purpose of the law is to ban any weapon that shoots really rapidly. And there's no question that with the use of a bump stock, and a semi-automatic weapon can be fired quite rapidly you can get 50 bullets into a clip, and that clip can probably be fired in about 10 seconds. So there's no question that this makes it a dangerous weapon. Justice Jackson says, well, really that means that Congress intended to ban it. But if you look at the actual words of the statute, what the law says is that any weapon that requires a separate movement of the trigger every time that there is a shot is not a machine gun.
Yeah, and I remember when this rule first came down, Richard, that there were some people demonstrating on YouTube, for example, that they could basically achieve the same thing by using their belt loop as a as a sort of bump stock for a way that they could fire the gun more rapidly. What were some of the reactions, though, from the other justices during these oral arguments? I mean, you talked about Justice Jackson. There's also a conservative majority on the court. What was their sort of posture towards this ATF attempt at defining a rule, rather?
Well, not every justice clearly expressed their views on this, but several of the justices, including both Justice Barrett and Justice Gorsuch, said to the government attorney, you know, we have some sympathy with your position. These really do look like dangerous weapons. However, we're not sure that it's appropriate for the executive branch to rewrite the law in order to say any dangerous weapon ought to be banned. So there was certainly a lot of pushback from some of the more conservative members of the court. It's going to be clearly a split decision. The three liberal members of the court, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson, all took the view that, well, this weapon is just too dangerous and we ought to go along with the executive branch. But there's clearly going to be some votes and probably 5 or 6 votes for the opposite view.
So it sounds like the court is reviewing the amicus curiae briefs. They are, hearing a response from petitioners from Attorney General Merrick Garland. And it sounds like they're going to make a decision relatively soon. But regardless, it seems to me, whatever way they decide, that Congress is going to need to follow up with some new legislation clarifying what the law really is on machine guns, and gun control has been extremely contentious in Congress. It doesn't seem we're going to get bipartisan legislation, but this seems something relatively easy for them to decide to clear up. Is it your sense that following this case, we're going to see some movement on Congress? Have you seen members of Congress take interest in this case with you?
We have, and a number of members of Congress filed Friends of the Court brief on both sides of the case. I think it's very interesting, though, that when the Trump administration in 2018 first announced that it was thinking about changing the longtime ATF policy and banning bump stocks, among the loudest critics were Democrats on Capitol Hill, who were strong advocates of gun control. The principal one was Senator Dianne Feinstein of California, and she said, I agree this is a dangerous weapon, but you do not have the power to unilaterally change the law. She was all set to go ahead with legislation on Capitol Hill, but that legislation did not move at all during 2018, most likely because some members of Congress liked the idea of being able to pass the buck to members of the executive branch and not have to make a decision. One of the real advantages of a court ruling in our favor in this case, it would be laying down a marker to Congress saying, hey, look, it's up to you to write the criminal laws. And if you would like to take a stand on this issue, go ahead and take a stand, but don't think you can take the easy way out and just allow the executive branch to act for you.
One final question for you before we have to go. The ATF has also been recently considering some other rule reinterpretations to be generous. They've been trying, for example, to crack down on the use of stabilizing braces. Are you hopeful that if you come out with a victory in this case, that could potentially tamp down future actions from the ATF in trying to legislate via bureaucracy?
I hope so. Certainly, you're correct that ATF has been trying to reinterpret a lot of rules as a way of expanding gun control. And if ATF loses here, of course, it will be responsible for reimbursing 500,000 Americans for having improperly seized their guns from them 3 years ago. And that kind of sanction might well give them pause before acting again.
All right, Richard Samp, thank you so much for joining us on Rising. We'll be back with more after this.
All right, thank you.